The agri-world of Hestia Prime died in 20 minutes. It did not die from orbital bombardment or a virus bomb. It died from the cold. The planetary governor was eating his dinner when the alarm started screaming. The warnings did not make sense. The sensors said the temperature outside had dropped by 100 degrees in a single second. The governor stood up and walked to his balcony. He opened the heavy blast shutters. The air that rushed in was not just cold. It was dead. It froze the soup in his bowl instantly. It froze the blood in his veins before he could even scream. His statue stood there for 3,000 years as a warning. Down in the fields, the harvest was ruined. The wheat turned white and shattered like glass when the wind blew. The millions of workers trying to gather the grain looked up at the sky. They expected to see the twisted ships of chaos or the green lightning of the Necrons. They saw neither. They saw a ship made of ribs and dead bone floating on a cloud of white fog. It looked like a myth from old Terra. It was the Naglfar. It sailed through the air as if the atmosphere was an ocean. Snow fell from its hull. Where the snow touched the ground, life ended. The planetary defense force tried to fight back. They were brave men and women with laser guns and flak armor. They ran to their tanks. The engines would not start. The promethium fuel had turned into a solid block of ice inside the lines. The soldiers' hands froze to their weapons. Then the riders came. They did not come in drop pods. They rode down from the sky on horses that looked like skeletons. The horses galloped on the air itself. The riders wore heavy armor made of jagged metal. It looked sharp and cruel. They looked like the Eldari, the ancient space elves, but they were taller and darker. They were the Red Riders. The commander of the defense force ordered his men to fire. Last bolts struck the riders and faded away like sparks in the blizzard. The riders did not even slow down. One of the riders raised a mace. He swung it at a tank. The metal of the tank shattered into dust. The rider laughed. It was a sound like ice cracking on a deep lake. The riders did not kill everyone. They were looking for something specific. They rode through the freezing cities and grabbed young people. They took those who had the spark of psychic power. They threw them into cages that hung from the sides of their spectral horses. An astropath in the main city tried to send a message for help. He sat in his tower and reached out with his mind into the warp. Usually, the warp was full of screaming demons and fire. Today, the astropath felt only silence. It was a silence that hurt. He felt a presence that was old and hungry. It was not a demon. It was something from another universe entirely. The astropath managed to send one single image before his brain froze solid. He sent an image of a king wearing a mask of skull and bone. The message reached a listening post in the Segmentum Solar. The Imperium of mankind is a slow beast. It takes years to move fleets and armies. But this message was different. The image of the Skull King came with a coordinate path. The enemy was not staying on Hestia Prime. The enemy was moving fast. The line of their travel pointed straight toward the throne world. They were moving toward Terra. The High Lords of Terra saw the report. They saw that 3 other worlds had gone silent in the last hour. This was not a raid. This was an invasion. The king of the wild hunt had arrived, and he was hunting for the most powerful psychic signal in the galaxy. He was hunting for the Emperor himself. The golden light of the Astronomicon was like a lighthouse calling him across the dark ocean of space. The silence of the grave spread across the subsector. The wild hunt began its ride. The Council of the High Lords of Terra met in a room that smelled of incense and old paper. The doors were made of gold and iron. They were closed and sealed. The message from Hestia Prime lay on the table. It was a simple data slate, but it felt heavy. The Lord High Admiral of the Imperial Navy looked at the image. He saw the ship made of bones. He saw the white fog. He did not like what he saw. He had fought orcs and tyranids and traitors. He understood enemies that bled. This enemy looked like a ghost story. The fabricator general of Mars made a clicking sound. His metal mechadendrites twitched. He said the temperature readings were impossible. Physics did not allow a planet to freeze that fast. The machine spirits of the sensors must be broken. But the reports were consistent. 3 worlds were dead. The line on the map was red and straight. It pointed at the Sol system. It pointed at Terra. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes stood in the corner. He was a giant in golden armor. He did not speak. He only watched. He knew that the Emperor was the ultimate prize. If this enemy wanted powerful souls, the Emperor was the brightest sun in the universe. The High Lords argued for an hour. They argued about resources. They argued about jurisdiction. This was the weakness of the Imperium. It was a giant that took a long time to wake up. Finally, the Captain General slammed the butt of his Guardian spear onto the floor. The sound was like a thunderclap. He told them to stop talking and start shooting. The defense of the throne world was already active. But they needed to stop this enemy before it reached the inner walls. They authorized the deployment of Battlefleet Solar. They ordered the interception at the Proxima Centauri jump point. Battlefleet Solar was the greatest gathering of warships in human history. There were miles of adamantium and guns. The flagship was the Divine Right. It was a flying city. Admiral Clytus stood on the bridge. He was an old man with a bionic eye. He looked out into the black void. He expected to see the enemy ships tear through reality from the warp. That was how enemies traveled. They used the Imperium. The Admiral had his navigators ready. He had his astropaths singing protective chants. The crew of the Divine Right was tense. Thousands of ratings and serfs worked in the lower decks. They loaded shells the size of buildings into the macro cannons. They sweated in the heat of the engines. They did not know what they were fighting. They only knew they had to follow orders or they would be shot. The sensors chimed. It was a soft sound, but it made everyone freeze. The enemy was not coming from the warp. The enemy was simply fading into existence. It was like a picture developing in a dark room. The Naglfar appeared 10,000 kilometers off the port bow. It was smaller than the Imperial battleships. It looked fragile. It was made of the ribs of some dead god, but it was surrounded by a cloud. The cloud was not gas. It was the white frost. Admiral Clytus did not hesitate. He gave the order to fire. The macro batteries of the Divine Right roared. The ship shook. The recoil was enough to crush a man. Giant shells flew across the void. They were designed to crack continents. They hit the white cloud around the Naglfar. They should have exploded. They should have turned the bone ship into dust. Instead, the shells slowed down. The explosive compounds inside the shells froze. The chemical reaction stopped. The shells hit the hull of the Naglfar with a dull thud. They bounced off like hail on a tin roof. The bridge crew stared in horror. The physics of war had just changed. The enemy ship did not fire back with lasers or plasma. It opened its hull. Hundreds of smaller craft flew out. They were the Red Riders. They rode on skiffs made of black ice. They moved faster than the eye could follow. They bypassed the void shields of the Imperial ships. Void shields were designed to stop high-velocity impacts and energy weapons. They were not designed to stop cold. The riders flew right through the energy barriers. The shields flickered and died as the generators froze. The alarm klaxon screamed throughout the fleet. Boarding torpedoes were launched from the Imperial cruisers. Space Marines from the Imperial Fist chapter were part of the fleet. They were the defenders of Terra. They wore yellow power armor. They were masters of siege warfare and defense. They knew how to hold a line. Captain Torgadon led the boarding party. He and his squad entered a boarding torpedo. The torpedo shot towards the Naglfar. It smashed into the bone hull. The melter cutters on the nose of the torpedo flared to life. They were supposed to burn a hole through the hull. The heat of the melters fought against the cold of the ship. Steam exploded violently. The metal groaned. Finally, they breached the hull. The ramp dropped. Captain Torgadon stormed out with his bolter raised. He expected to see corridors and bulkheads. He saw a frozen wasteland. The inside of the ship was bigger than the outside. It looked like a snow-covered plain under a black sky. It was impossible. This was sorcery. The Imperial Fist did not panic. They formed a defensive line. They began to advance. Their boots crunched on the snow. Their armor sensors screamed warnings. The temperature was near absolute zero. Their fusion packs were working overtime to keep them warm. Then the enemy appeared. There were tall warriors in heavy plate armor. The armor looked like skeletal muscles. They carried heavy maces and swords. They were the NL. They did not shout. They did not scream like orcs. They walked forward with a terrifying silence. Torgadon gave the order to fire. The bolters roared. The explosive rounds hit the NL warriors. The rounds detonated. Shards of ceramic armor flew. 2 of the elven warriors fell. They bled red blood. This was good. If they bled, they could be killed. But there were too many of them. And then the hounds came. They were beasts made of ice and hate. They leaped at the space marines. A hound bit into the arm of a marine. The ceramite armor cracked like frozen glass. The marine did not scream, but he fell back. Back in space, the battle was turning into a slaughter. The white frost was spreading. It reached out from the Naglfar like a giant hand. It touched the escort frigate. His will be done. The frigate died instantly. The plasma drive froze solid. The metal of the hull contracted and shattered. The ship broke into 1 billion pieces. The crew floated in the void, frozen statues in seconds. Admiral Clytus watched this on his tactical hololith. He realized that range was his only safety. He ordered the fleet to pull back. He wanted to use the Nova cannons. These were weapons that fired projectiles at near light speed. They could destroy a moon. The fleet began to turn. It was a slow maneuver. The engines strained. The Naglfar did not chase them. It just kept moving forward. It was heading for the black ships. The black ships were a special fleet. They traveled the galaxy collecting psychers. They brought the witches to Terra to be fed to the Golden Throne. There were thousands of psychers in the holds of the nearby transport fleet. They were screaming. They could feel the wild hunt coming. To the wild hunt, the black ships were a buffer. The king of the wild hunt, Eredin, stood on the deck of the Naglfar. He wore a mask that looked like a skull. He sensed the power in the black ships. He raised his sword. The Naglfar accelerated. It did not use engines. It rode the winds between the spheres. It appeared right in the middle of the convoy of black ships. The Red Riders swarmed out again. They landed on the hulls of the prison ships. They cut through the airlocks. Inside the black ships, the Sisters of Silence stood guard. They were nulls. They had no souls. Magic and psychic power did not work on them. They were the perfect counter to demons. When the Red Riders broke in, the Sisters attacked. They used greatswords and bolters. The Red Riders were confused for a moment. Their magic faltered near the Sisters. Eredin's navigators tried to open portals on the deck, but the portals fizzled out. The Sisters of Silence were a blank spot in reality. The NL had never fought something like this. A sister beheaded a rider with a fluid strike. For a moment, it seemed the Imperium had an advantage, but the riders were not just mages. They were master swordsmen. They had fought for thousands of years. They adjusted their tactics. They stopped using magic and used brute force. They were taller and stronger than the sisters. The corridors of the black ship filled with the sound of clashing steel. Captain Torgadden and his Imperial fists were still stuck inside the Naglfar. They were fighting a losing battle. The cold was draining their power packs. Torgadden checked his ammunition. He was low. He saw a figure approaching through the blizzard. It was one of the Wild Hunt's navigators, Caranthir. The mage held a staff topped with a glowing orb. He pointed the staff at the Space Marines. A blast of pure cold hit them. 3 Marines were instantly frozen. Their hearts stopped. Torgadden charged. He fired his last bolt rounds. The mage deflected them with a wall of ice. Torgadden drew his combat knife. He was a veteran of 100 campaigns. He would not die here. He lunged at the mage. The mage teleported. He vanished in a puff of snow and reappeared behind Torgadden. A blast of ice hit Torgadden's back. The fusion pack on his armor died. The suit locked up. Torgadden fell to his knees. He could not move. The cold seeped into his skin. He looked up. The mage did not finish him off. The mage turned away. The Space Marines were not the target. They were just an annoyance. A turn. The Naglfar finished its work on the black ships. The riders dragged thousands of psychers out of the holes. They threw them into the portals leading to the Naglfar. The psychers were terrified. They knew they were going to a fate worse than the Golden Throne. The Sisters of Silence fought to the last woman, but they were overwhelmed by numbers. Eredin had what he wanted, fresh slaves, fresh power, but he also sensed something else. He looked at the distant yellow star of the Sol system. He felt the Astronomicon. It was brighter than anything he had ever seen. It was a beacon that promised unlimited power. If he could capture the source of that light, the NL would never have to fear the white frost again. They could conquer all worlds. He gave a silent command. The Naglfar turned away from the wreckage of the black ships. It ignored the heavy fire from Battlefleet Solar. It did not care about the battleships. It faded from reality again, jumping closer to Terra. Admiral Clytus slammed his fist on the railing. The enemy had slipped through his fingers. He had lost 3 frigates and a black ship, and he had not even scratched the paint of the enemy flagship. He looked at the sensor officer. He asked where they were going. The officer's face was pale. He said they were heading for Titan. Titan was the moon of Saturn. It was the fortress of the Grey Knights. It was the most secret place in the Imperium. If the Wild Hunt went there, they would face the demon hunters. Admiral Clytus ordered the fleet to pursue. He knew they would be too late. The engines of the Divine Right flared blue. The massive ship turned slowly, like a dying whale. The crew was exhausted. The decks were cold. The morale was breaking. They had fired their biggest guns and nothing happened. A murmur started among the lower deck crews. They whispered that this was the end times. They whispered that the Emperor had forsaken them. Commissars moved through the decks, executing anyone who spoke of defeat. The sound of bolt pistols rang out in the mess halls. This was the Imperial way. Order must be maintained, even in the face of the apocalypse. On the bridge, a tech priest approached the Admiral. The priest's robes were red and ragged. He held a data slate with trembling hands. He said he had analyzed the readings from the Naglfar. He said the ship was not entirely real. It existed in a state of flux between dimensions. That was why the shells bounced off. The ship was only partially in this universe. To hit it, they needed to anchor it. They needed a Geller field. But Geller fields were used to keep the warp out. not to keep enemies in. The Admiral frowned. He was not a scientist. He was a soldier. He asked if it could be done. The tech priest said it was theoretically possible to invert the field, to project a bubble of reality that would force the Naglfar to become solid. But it would require a ship to get very close. Suicide close. The Admiral nodded. He understood sacrifice. He looked at the roster of his fleet. He chose a light cruiser, the Sword of Truth. He sent the order. The captain of the Sword of Truth acknowledged. There was no hesitation, just duty. The Wild Hunt appeared in the orbit of Saturn. The rings of the planet were beautiful and vast. The Naglfar floated above them like a stain. Titan hung below, a grey and forbidding moon. The Grey Knights were already awake. They were the Emperor's final gift to humanity. They were all psychers. They were the bane of demons. Grand Master Volder stood on the battlements of the fortress monastery. He felt the cold. It was different from the cold of the warp. It felt empty. He reached out with his mind. He touched the minds of the enemy. He recoiled. Their minds were alien, arrogant, and old. They were elven, but twisted by hate and desperation. They were not servants of the Chaos Gods. They were something else. They were invaders from a dying timeline. Voldus raised his force halberd. He ordered the defense batteries of Titan to open fire. The surface of the moon lit up with lasers and missiles. The sky burned. The Naglfar took the hits. The shield of cold absorbed the energy, but the sheer volume of fire slowed it down. Eredin sent his riders down. They rode on the clouds of Saturn. They descended on Titan. This was a mistake. The Grey Knights were not frantic militia. They were not standard space marines. They were weapons made to kill nightmares. When the Red Riders landed on the basalt plains of Titan, they were met by a wall of silver armor. The Grey Knights used their psychic powers. They summoned fire and lightning. The ice of the riders met the fire of the Emperor. Steam covered the battlefield. A rider swung his sword at a Grey Knight. The knight parried with his halberd. The Nemesis force weapon flared with psychic energy. It shattered the rider's sword. The knight thrust the halberd forward. It pierced the rider's chest. The rider screamed and exploded into ice shards. The Grey Knights could kill them. But for every rider that fell, the temperature dropped another degree. The atmosphere of Titan was already thin, but now it was freezing into liquid on the ground. The machinery of the fortress began to fail. The auto-loaders on the defense turrets jammed. The void shields over the monastery flickered. Eredin himself descended. He wanted to test these warriors. He landed in the courtyard of the fortress. He was surrounded by his honor guard. Grand Master Voldus stepped forward to meet him. It was a duel of legends. Eredin was taller, faster, and wielded magic that Voldus had never seen. Voldus was stronger, tougher, and fueled by the faith of the Emperor. They clashed. The sound was like a bell tolling for the dead. Eredin's sword was coated in permafrost. Every time it hit Voldus's armor, frost spread across the silver plates. Voldus smashed his hammer into Eredin's shield. The shield cracked. Eredin laughed. He enjoyed this. He had not fought a worthy opponent in centuries. High above, the Sword of Truth arrived. It was burning its engines to destruction. It dove towards the Naglfar. The crew of the cruiser knew they were dead men. The captain ordered the tech priest to invert the Geller field. The engines screamed. The ship got within 10 kilometers of the bone ship. The tech priest pulled the levers. The Geller field generator groaned and reversed its polarity. A bubble of hard reality expanded from the cruiser. It hit the Naglfar. The ghost ship shuddered. For the first time, it became fully solid. It was trapped in the laws of physics. The Sword of Truth rammed the Naglfar. It was a small ship hitting a giant, but it caused damage. The impact tore a hole in the side of the bone ship. The sword of truth exploded. The explosion ripped through the Naglfar's lower decks. On the surface of Titan, Eredin felt the shock. His connection to his ship wavered. The portal he had opened to bring more troops began to close. He looked at Voldus. The Grey Knight was bleeding, his armor covered in ice, but he was still standing. Eredin made a calculation. He could win this fight, but he might lose his ship. And the ship was his lifeline. He needed to repair it. He needed to regroup. He stepped back. He cast a spell of blinding white light. When the light faded, he was gone. The Red Riders on the ground vanished with him, turning into mist. The Naglfar, wounded and smoking, pulled away from Titan. It limped into the dark between the planets. The Geller field bubble had collapsed when the cruiser exploded, so the ship could phase out again. But it was slower now. It was bleeding snow and debris. The Grey Knights stood amidst the ruins of their outer defences. They had held, but the cost was high. Brother Captain Arvan Stern looked at the frozen bodies of his brothers. Their gene seed was ruined by the cold. It could not be harvested. This was a tragedy for the chapter. Voldus watched the sky. He knew this was not a victory. It was a delay. The enemy had tested them. The enemy now knew their strength, and the enemy was still heading for Terra. The Naglfar was damaged, but it was not destroyed. And now the Wild Hunt would be angry. The cold wind howled over the plains of Titan. It sounded like a funeral dirge. In the depths of the Imperial Palace on Terra, the Adeptus Custodes tightened their grip on their spears. The report from Titan had arrived. The enemy could bleed. The enemy could be hurt. But the enemy was powerful enough to assault the Grey Knights on their home ground and survive. The Emperor sat on the golden throne, a skeletal corpse bound to a machine. His mind was fighting 1 billion battles in the warp. But a sliver of his attention turned to the material realm. He felt the cold approaching. He felt the familiarity of it. It was not chaos. It was a predatory order. It was the end of all things. The golden throne hummed louder. The psychic beacon of the Astronomicon flared. It was a challenge. The Emperor was not hiding. He was waiting. Meanwhile, in the lower hives of Terra, the temperature began to drop. It was subtle at first. People put on extra coats. The Rekcaf units served hotter sludge. But the rats knew. The rats were moving deep underground. They were running away from the surface. The homeless who slept in the upper spires were found frozen in the morning. The Arbites tried to keep order, but panic was a slow poison. Rumors spread that the sun was dying. Rumors spread that the Emperor had finally died, and the warmth of his love was gone. Cults sprang up. Doomsday preachers stood on street corners, shouting that the great winter was here. They were not wrong. The Wild Hunt was wounded, but it was like a wounded wolf. It was more dangerous than ever. It would not try a frontal assault again. It would try something more cunning. It would use the fear of the human population against the defenders. Admiral Clytus received the damage reports on the bridge of the Divine Right. The fleet was combat ineffective. The morale was shattered. He needed time to repair. He needed time to thaw the guns, but he did not have time. He ordered the fleet to form a defensive shell around Terra. He knew it was a futile gesture. If the Grey Knights couldn't stop them, his ships were just metal coffins. He looked at his hand. It was trembling. He clenched it into a fist. He would do his duty. He would die with his boots on. He looked at the tactical map. The red dot of the Naglfar was stationary near Jupiter. It was repairing. It was gathering strength. The game of cat and mouse was over. The siege was about to begin. The final line of defense was the Sol system itself, and the Sol system was freezing. The moisture in the ventilation systems of the ships turned to ice. The breath of the crew came out in white puffs. The cold was inside the ships now. It was inside their minds. The long night had come to the 41st millennium. A single shuttle launched from the surface of Mars. It carried a Magos biologist. He had a theory. He had studied the frozen corpses of the defenders on Hestia Prime. He found something in their cells. The ice was not just water. It was a crystalline structure that responded to psychic energy. It was a conduit. The Wild Hunt was not just freezing people. They were turning them into batteries. Every frozen corpse amplified the power of the king. This changed everything. If the population of Terra began to freeze, they would become a weapon for Eredin. The Magos needed to get this information to the High Lords. But the Vox channels were jammed with static. The static sounded like hounds baying. The Magos pushed the engines of his shuttle. He had to reach the palace. He had to tell them that the cold was not the weapon. The cold was the network, and the network was coming online. The sky above Terra turned a pale, sickly grey. Snow began to fall on the equator. The impossible had happened. It was snowing in the hive cities. Children looked up in wonder, having never seen snow. Their parents looked up in terror. The first flake touched the ground. The siege of Terra had begun. The snow falling on the Imperial Palace was not white. It was grey. It picked up the smog and the ash from the atmosphere of Terra and brought it down to the ground. The golden roof of the Sanctum Imperialis was covered in a layer of dirty slush. This was the first time in 10,000 years that winter had touched the seat of the Emperor. The custodes stood at their posts. They did not shiver. Their biology was engineered to withstand any environment. But they were worried. They could see the breath puffing out from the grills of their helmets. They had to wipe frost off their guardian spears. The heating systems of the palace were old. They were designed to cool down massive reactors, not to warm up kilometer-high hallways. The pipes groaned. The marble floors became slick. The servants of the palace wrapped themselves in tapestries torn from the walls. They huddled around data stacks that gave off heat. The Magos biologist, whose name was Thren, stood before the High Lords of Terra. He had survived the flight from Mars. His shuttle was damaged by the cold, but he had the data. He plugged his mechadendrites into the central cogitator of the council chamber. The image of a frozen soldier appeared on the hololith. Thren explained the horror. The ice was not passive. The crystal structure of the ice was trapping the bioelectricity of the victim. It was also trapping the echo of their soul. The Wild Hunt was not just killing people. They were preserving them. Every frozen body was a tiny psychic battery. When thousands of them were stacked together, they created a resonance. It was like a radio tower made of dead meat. Thren pointed to the map. He showed the trajectory of the Naglfar. It was repairing near Jupiter. But the frozen debris field from the battle at Titan was drifting. The frozen corpses of the Grey Knights and the sailors were drifting. They were forming a network. The Wild Hunt was building a web of signal boosters. The Captain General of the Custodes looked at the map. He understood the strategy. The enemy was creating a path for their magic. They were terraforming the warp just as they terraformed the air. If enough people on Terra froze, the Naglfar would not need to fly there. It could simply step through a portal instantly. The walls of the palace, the void shields, the guns, none of it would matter. The enemy would appear inside the throne room. The High Lords were silent. The Fabricator General of Mars was the first to speak. He spoke in a screech of binary code that the translators turned into Low Gothic. He said that Mars was also under threat. The iron ring around Mars was icing over. The shipyards were paralyzed. He demanded that the fleet be sent to protect the Red Planet. The Lord High Admiral argued back. He said the fleet was the only thing keeping the Naglfar at bay. If they moved to Mars, Terra would be open. The argument was cut short by a priority alert from the Jupiter perimeter. The sensors had picked up a new energy signature. It was not the cold white of the Wild Hunt. It was a sick green. It was the color of a dying star. Space tore open near the moon of Ganymede. A fleet emerged. They were ships made of living metal. They were shaped like crescents and pyramids. They moved with no inertia. They were the Necrons. The Necrons had not come to save humanity. They had come to sanitize a laboratory accident. The overlord in command was from the Sautek dynasty. His logic banks had calculated that the white frost was a dimensional breach that threatened the stability of the galaxy. The Necrons wished to rule the galaxy, not see it turned into an ice cube. The white frost destroyed matter at an atomic level. It stopped the movement of atoms. If all atoms stopped, the Necrons could never reverse their biotransference. They could never become flesh again. Therefore, the Wild Hunt was a variable that had to be deleted. The Necron fleet did not hail the Imperium. They did not hail the Wild Hunt. They simply opened fire. They fired Gauss arcs. These weapons stripped targets molecule by molecule. They fired on the drifting debris field. The frozen corpses of the Imperial heroes were vaporized. The batteries were destroyed. This was good for the Imperium strategically, but it was a horror to watch. The bodies of brave men were being erased from history. Then the Necrons turned their guns on the Naglfar. The Naglfar was still wounded. Its rib bones were cracked. The ice cloud around it was thin. Eredin, the king of the Wild Hunt, stood on his bridge. He saw the new enemy. He felt no fear. He felt only annoyance. The machines had no souls. They had no warmth to steel. They were cold metal, but metal could still break. Eredin raised his staff. He called upon the white frost. He did not aim it at the Necron ships. He aimed it at the space between them. The vacuum of space is already cold, but Eredin made it absolute. He stopped time in a localized bubble. The Necron energy beams hit the bubble and froze. Green lightning turned into solid, jagged lines of energy suspended in the dark. It was physically impossible, but Eredin bent physics. The Necron overlord adjusted his tactics. Logic dictated that energy weapons were ineffective against an entropy manipulator. He ordered the deployment of canoptek scarabs. Millions of small beetle-like machines flew out of the Necron tomb ships. They swarmed towards the Naglfar. They were made of living metal. They did not feel cold. They began to eat the ice. They ate the bone whole. The Red Riders came out to fight them. It was a battle of silent monsters. The skeletal riders smashed the metal beetles. The beetles swarmed over the riders and stripped their armor. The Imperial Navy watched from a distance. Admiral Clytus had a choice. He could let them fight and hope they destroyed each other, or he could intervene. His advisors told him to wait, but the Magos Thren warned him. If the Necrons used their heavy weapons, like the transdimensional thunderbolts near Jupiter, they could ignite the gas giant's atmosphere. The explosion would wipe out the inner system. It would scour Terra. The Imperium could not let the Necrons use their full power. Clytus ordered the fleet to advance. It was a three-way war. The Imperial ships fired at the Necrons to stop them from blowing up Jupiter. They fired at the Wild Hunt to stop them from eating the Necrons. The void around Jupiter became a chaotic storm. Macro cannon shells slammed into Necron shields. Green Gauss fire flayed the hull of Imperial cruisers. Ice storms swallowed squadrons of fighters. On Terra, the situation got worse. The Necron arrival had distracted the fleet. Eredin saw this. He was a master tactician. He knew he could not win a direct fight against the metal men and the humans at the same time. He needed to change the board. He needed to accelerate the endgame. He looked at Terra. He saw the psychic light of the Emperor. He saw the billions of souls huddled in the hive cities. He did not need to capture the palace yet. He just needed a foothold. Eredin gathered his most powerful navigators. They linked their minds. They bypassed the battle at Jupiter. They threw a spear of magic across the solar system. It was invisible to radar. It was only visible to the astropaths on Terra, who screamed as it passed them. The spear struck a target. It did not hit the palace. It hit Hive City Secundus. Hive Secundus was a mountain of steel and concrete housing 4 billion people. It was a manufacturing hub. It produced rations and air filters. The magical spear struck the spire of the hive. It did not explode. It blossomed. A flower of ice the size of a continent opened up. The top of the hive froze instantly. The cold rushed down the elevator shafts. It rushed through the ventilation ducts. It moved faster than a dropping elevator. Inside the hive, people were working their shifts. They looked up as the air vents turned white. Then the cold hit them. It was not a gradual freezing. It was instant. A worker holding a wrench froze mid-swing. The wrench and his hand became one piece of brittle ice. A mother feeding her child froze. The soup in the spoon turned to a pebble. In 10 minutes, the top half of the hive was dead. 2 billion people died without taking a breath. But they were not just dead. As Margos Thren had warned, there were batteries. The massive structure of Hive Secundus, now encased in ice, began to hum. It became a beacon. The psychic energy of 2 billion souls was trapped in the ice. Eredin used it. He anchored a portal to the frozen city. Above the hive, the sky tore open. The Naglfar did not come through. It was still fighting the Necrons. But the Red Riders came through. Thousands of them, and larger things. The Wild Hunt brought their beasts. Massive bears made of snow and bone. Giants that looked like Norse myths. They poured out of the portal and onto the roof of the frozen hive. They began to march down. They were inside the atmospheric shield of Terra. They were on the ground. The planetary defense force of Hive Secundus tried to hold the lower levels. The lower levels were still warm. The soldiers set up barricades in the corridors. They aimed their laser guns at the ceiling. The ceiling dripped freezing water. Then the ceiling cracked. The riders dropped down. The fight was claustrophobic. In the tight corridors of the hive, the long reach of the riders' weapons was a disadvantage, but their aura of cold was devastating. The defenders' eyes watered, and the tears froze, blinding them. The laser guns' batteries drained in seconds due to the temperature. It was a massacre. The news reached the palace. The High Lords were in a panic. An enemy army was on the surface of Terra. They held a fortified position, and the frozen hive was amplifying the cold. The temperature in the palace dropped another 10 degrees. The intricate machinery of the Golden Throne began to register error codes. The Emperor was struggling. The cold was dampening his connection to the warp. The Astronomicon was flickering. Across the galaxy, ships relying on the Astronomicon to navigate went blind. They were lost in the warp. This was the strategic catastrophe. The supply lines of the Imperium were cut. The reinforcement fleets coming to help Terra were stranded. Terra was alone. The Captain General of the Custodes, Trajan Valoris, made a decision. He looked at the Lord High Admiral. He told him to target Hive Secundus. The Admiral stared at him. He asked if the Captain General meant an orbital bombardment. Valoris said yes. He ordered the fleet to use the lance batteries. They had to destroy the hive. They had to shatter the ice battery. The Admiral protested. There were still 2 billion living people in the lower levels. They were loyal citizens. They were praying for salvation. To fire on them was to kill 2 billion innocent subjects. Valorous did not blink. He said that if the hive stood, the Emperor would fall. If the Emperor fell, every human in the galaxy would die. 2 billion was a small price to pay for the species. It was the cruel calculus of the 41st millennium. The order was relayed to a destroyer in low orbit, the Hand of Judgment. The captain of the Hand of Judgment wept as he entered the firing keys. He recited the prayers of forgiveness. The ship rotated its ventral lances. Down in the lower levels of Hive Secundus, the defenders heard the sky rumble. They thought it was reinforcements. They cheered. Then the light came. It was not the light of the sun. It was the blinding column of turbo laser fire. The beam struck the spire of the hive. The ice vaporized instantly. The steam explosion was bigger than a nuclear bomb. The structure of the hive collapsed. 4 billion tons of metal and concrete imploded. The shockwave flattened the surrounding hab blocks for 100 kilometers. The beacon was destroyed. The portal closed. The Red Riders who were on the ground were cut off. The connection to Eredin was severed. But the cost was ash and silence. A crater smoked where a city used to be. The psychic scream of the dying billions washed over the palace. It hid the Emperor. On the golden throne, the corpse god twitched. A single tear of blood rolled from his dry eye socket. The backlash of the death hit the astropaths in the choir. 50 of them died instantly, their brains boiling from the psychic overload. Back at Jupiter, the Necrons detected the destruction of the anomaly on Terra. The logic was satisfied. The immediate threat of the amplifier was gone. The Overlord calculated that the biomass of the humans was effectively combating the ice entity. It was inefficient for the Necrons to expend more resources. They had damaged the Naglfar. They had ensured the infection was contained to the Sol system. The Overlord ordered a withdrawal. The Necron ships turned. They phased out of reality. They left as quickly as they came. They left the Imperium alone with the monster. The Naglfar was alone again. It was heavily damaged. The Necron scarabs had eaten large holes in its hull. Eredin was furious. He had lost his foothold on Terra. He had lost a battalion of his best riders. But he saw what the humans did. He saw them burn their own people. He smiled behind his skull mask. He understood them now. They were desperate. They were willing to destroy themselves to stop him. He could use that. He did not retreat. He moved the Naglfar into the cover of the wreckage of the Imperial ships destroyed in the crossfire. He began to sing a new song. It was not a song of ice. It was a song of despair. He projected his voice into the minds of the defenders on Terra. He whispered to them. He told them that the High Lords had killed the Hive. He told them that their leaders were the real monsters. He sowed the seeds of rebellion. On Terra, the temperature did not rise. The ash from the burning hive blocked the sun even more. The nuclear winter combined with the supernatural winter. The snow turned black. In the streets of the remaining hives, people began to riot. They were hungry, they were cold, and they had seen the sky fire burn their brothers. Chaos cults that had been hiding in the shadows saw their chance. They did not worship the chaos gods this time. They worshipped the cold. They called it the peace of the end. They sabotaged the heating units. They opened the airlock doors. They wanted the pain to stop. They wanted the sleep of the ice. Aten. The imperial fists on the walls of the palace faced a new threat. It was not an army of elves. It was a mob of billions of desperate, freezing humans storming the gates, begging for warmth or death. The Space Marines had to look down their sights at the citizens they were sworn to protect. Captain General Valoris stood on the wall. He watched the riots. He knew this was the second phase of the attack. The enemy was breaking their spirit, and in the warp, something else was happening. The Great Rift, the cicatrix maledictum, was usually a roaring storm of emotion, but the silence from Terra was affecting it. The diamonds were confused. The bloodthirsters of Khorne wanted to fight, but their blood was thickening. The Nurgle demons found that their viruses were dormant in the cold. The change of Tzeentch was frozen in a static state. The excessive sensations of Slaanesh were dulled by the numbness. The Chaos Gods were not united often, but they were united in this. The Wild Hunt was stealing their food. The souls of humanity were being put in a freezer where the gods could not eat them. A messenger arrived at the system edge. It was a singular ship, twisted and spiked. It bore the mark of the Black Legion. It did not fire. It broadcast a Pali code on an ancient frequency, one used during the Horus Heresy. It was a request to talk. Abaddon, the Despoiler, had sent an emissary. The arch-enemy of mankind was offering a truce. They wanted to help destroy the Wild Hunt. The High Lords received the message. The sheer insanity of it made them pause. To ally with Chaos was the ultimate heresy. It was damnation. But the report from the Muggles was clear. The temperature was still dropping. The Naglfar was regenerating its ice armor. The Necrons had left them to die. The Imperial fleet was at 40% strength. The decision lay on the table. The Inquisition representative, Lord Inquisitor Cotiers, looked at the message. He had hunted demons his whole life. He touched the rosette on his chest. He said that to accept the help of the archenemy was to invite corruption, but to refuse was to accept extinction. The Imperium, broken, freezing, and staring at a hand offered by the devil himself. The cold wind howled through the broken stained glass of the Eternity Gate. The Emperor sat silent on his throne, the ice creeping up the golden steps. The golden light was dim. The long winter was entering its darkest hour. The strategic board was no longer about victory. It was about how much of their soul they would sell to survive the night. The emissary of the Black Legion did not land in a shuttle. He teleported directly into the grand chamber of the Senatorum Imperialis. The teleportation flare was red and smelled of brimstone. The custodes raised their spears instantly. The bolters of the distinct palace guard locked onto the figure. The figure was a sorcerer of Tzeentch, encased in blue and gold power armor covered in screaming faces. He held a staff topped with a burning eye. He did not attack. He simply held up a hand. The temperature in the room, which had been freezing, rose by 10 degrees. The heat radiating from him was sickening, like a fever, but it was heat. The High Lords recoiled. Inquisitor Cotier stepped forward. His hammer was heavy in his hand. He asked why the servants of the ruinous powers would care if humanity froze. The sorcerer spoke. His voice sounded like two stones grinding together. He explained the metaphysics of the warp. The Chaos Gods feed on emotion. They feed on rage, hope, despair, and pleasure. The white frost was not just cold. It was the absence of feeling. It was the stillness of the grave. If the Emperor's subjects became frozen statues, there would be no more dreams for the gods to eat. The galaxy would become a silent tomb. Chaos would starve. Therefore, the great game had changed. The predator did not want the cattle to die of cold. The predator wanted the cattle to remain warm enough to bleed. The debate that followed was the shortest in Imperial history. There was no time for moralizing. The sensors showed the Naglfar moving again. It was heading for Mars. The Fabricator General let out a binary scream. If Mars fell, the Holy Forges would stop. The Titans would be buried in ice. The Imperium would lose the ability to make ammunition. Captain General Valoris looked at the Chaos Sorcerer. He looked at the shivering lords. He gave the order. The truce was accepted. It was named the Pact of Ash. It was the most shameful moment in the history of the Imperium, and it was necessary. The blockade of the Sol system changed. The ragged ships of the Imperial Navy were joined by the jagged nightmare ships of the heretics. The Vengeful Spirit, the flagship of the Black Legion, broke real space near Venus. It was a massive vessel, bristling with demon-infused cannons. It flew alongside the Divine Right. To any loyal citizen, this sight was madness. It was a sign of the end times. The comms channels were filled with the screams of demons and the prayers of priests. But the guns of both fleets pointed in the same direction. They pointed at the Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt had surrounded Mars. The red planet was turning white. The Naglfar hovered over the Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system. Eredin wanted to freeze the core of the planet. If he froze the core, the magnetic field would collapse, and the machine spirits of Mars would die. The Red Riders descended on the iron dunes. They were met by the Skitarii. The soldiers of the machine god were cyborgs. They did not feel pain, but their hydraulics froze. Their oil turned to sludge. The riders smashed through the lines of the Skitarii Rangers. The dune crawlers, massive spider tanks, slipped on the ice and fell into canyons. Then the Chaos Terminators arrived. They did not use drop pods. They tore holes in reality and stepped out onto the Martian surface. They were the World Eaters. They were berserkers who worshipped the god of war. They carried chain axes that glowed with unholy heat. They did not care about tactics. They charged the Red Riders. The clash was elemental. The ice of the riders met the hellfire of the berserkers. A World Eater shouted, "Blood for the blood god," and swung his axe. The heat of the weapon melted the ice armor of a rider. The blade cut through bone and frozen flesh. The rider died, steaming. The World Eaters did not feel the cold because their blood was boiling with rage. They were too angry to freeze. In orbit, the battle was a chaotic storm. The Chaos ships used weapons that the Imperium had banned thousands of years ago. They fired shells filled with warp fire. When these shells hit the Naglfar, they did not just explode, they screamed. The warp fire burned even in the vacuum. It ate the white frost. The Naglfar's defensive cloud began to shrink. Eredin stood on his bridge. For the first time he felt concern. He understood the order of the Necrons. He understood the defiance of the Imperium. But this new enemy was pure anarchy. It was energy that refused to obey laws. The white frost tried to slow down the atoms of the warp fire, but the fire kept changing its state. It shifted from heat to sound to color. It was impossible to predict. Admiral Cletus watched the tactical display. He saw the Chaos ships taking heavy losses. The Wild Hunt was focusing its attention on them. Eredin knew the Chaos ships were the real threat. He sent his navigators to focus their magic on the Vengeful Spirit. Giant spears of ice, miles long, formed in the void. They flew towards the Chaos flagship. The void shields of the Vengeful Spirit flared purple and broke. One ice spear punched through the lower decks. It did not explode. It started to grow. The ice spread through the ship like a cancer. The Chaos crew fought back. They summoned demons to eat the ice. The inside of the ship became a war between frozen silence and screaming madness. On the surface of Mars, the strategic situation shifted. The Fabricator General ordered the awakening of the Titans. The Legio Ignatum, the fire wasps, walked out of their hangars. These were god machines, hundreds of feet tall. They carried plasma destructors and volcano cannons. Usually, they took days to activate, but the tech priests bypassed the rituals. They poured sacred oil into the reactors and prayed. The Titans walked into the blizzard. The princeps inside the Titans linked their minds to the machines. They saw the world through heat sensors. The Red Riders looked like ghosts of cold blue on their screens. The lead titan, Magnificum Incendia, fired its volcano cannon. The beam was as hot as a small sun. It hit a group of wild hunt giants. The giants were vaporized. The steam blast cleared the weather for 5 kilometers. The Skitarii cheered in their binary language, but the wild hunt was adaptable. Eredin saw the titans. He saw they were the anchors of the defense. He ordered his mages to combine their power. They did not attack the titans physically. They attacked the ground beneath them. The mages cast a spell of deep permafrost. The ground of Mars, which was iron, oxide, and rock, froze down to the bedrock. Then the mages shattered it. The ground turned into a fluid powder. It was like quicksand made of dry ice. The massive feet of the titans sank. The Magnificum Incendia lost its balance. The giant machine toppled forward. It crashed into the ice with the sound of a falling city. The impact cracked the reactor casing. The Titan did not explode. It leaked radiation and heat, but the cold swallowed it. The crew inside froze to death while trapped in their burning machine. The world eaters on the ground were losing momentum. The cold was sapping their strength. Their rage kept them warm, but even rage needs fuel. They were running out of enemies to kill close up. The Red Riders were pulling back, using hit-and-run tactics. They were luring the berserkers into traps of ice spikes. The Chaos Sorcerers in orbit realized they needed a bigger ritual. They contacted the Imperial Librarians. This was the most dangerous moment of the war. The Psychers of the Emperor and the Sorcerers of the Eye had to link minds. The ritual took place on the moon of Phobos. A circle of Imperial Librarians stood opposite a circle of Black Legion sorcerers. In the center was a pyre of burning promethium. They began to chant. The Imperials chanted for the light of the Astronomicon. The heretics chanted for the fires of the warp. The two energies clashed and mixed. It was agonizing. Several librarians began to bleed from their eyes. Their souls were being singed by the touch of chaos, but the result was effective. A wave of psychic heat rolled out from Phobos. It washed over Mars. The heat wave hit the battlefield. The ice on the armor of the Skitarii melted. The guns of the tanks thawed. The ground hardened again. The Imperium and Chaos forces surged forward. The Red Riders were pushed back. They retreated to the base of the Olympus Mons. They were cornered. Eredin saw that he was losing the ground war. He made a ruthless calculation. He could not hold Mars, but he could ruin it. He ordered the Naglfar to drop its secondary anchors. These were massive chains made of shadow and bone. They fell from orbit and latched onto the peak of Olympus Mons. The ship began to pull. Eredin was not trying to lift the mountain. He was trying to tear the crust of the planet. He wanted to cause a geological catastrophe that would bury the forges forever. The ground shook. Volcanic vents opened up, but instead of lava, they spewed freezing gas. The tectonic plates of Mars groaned. The Fabricator General screamed on the Vox. He told the fleet to destroy the chains. Admiral Clytus ordered all ships to close range. The Divine Right and the Vengeful Spirit flew side by side. They unleashed a broadside. Macro cannons, lance batteries, and hell-forged missiles hammered the chains. The chains were incredibly strong, reinforced with magic. They vibrated but did not break. The mountain began to crack. A fissure opened up near the Manufactorum district. Factories slid into the abyss. Then the Black Legion captain made a move that surprised everyone. He did not fire at the chains. He fired at the surface of Mars. He fired a bombardment of virus bombs. Usually, virus bombs eat organic matter, but these were modified with warp sickness. They hit the Red Riders clustered at the mountain base. The virus attacked the magical bonds that held the riders together. The skeletons began to dissolve into green sludge. The spectral horses melted. The virus ate the magic itself. It was a weapon against sorcery. The Wild Hunt suffered a massive blow. Thousands of riders were unmade in seconds. Eredin felt the backlash. His army was being eaten by a logic plague from the warp. He had to sever the link. He cut the chains. The Naglfar lurched upwards, free of the planet. The geological stress ended, but the damage was done. The virus was spreading. It was not just eating the riders. It was eating the data cables of the Mechanicus. It was infecting the machine spirits. The Skitarii started to convulse. Their cybernetics turned against them. They began to open fire on each other. The Imperium had saved Mars from the ice, but they had infected it with madness. The Chaos Allies had used a dirty weapon. The Fabricator General shut down the global noosphere, the Internet of Mars, to stop the virus. The planet went dark. The forges stopped. The defense grid went offline. The victory was a strategic disaster. Mars was saved, but it was useless. It could produce no supplies. The blockade of Terra was now the only line of supply, and it was running on empty. Eredin moved the Naglfar away from Mars. He was wounded again. His fleet was smaller, but he had achieved a strategic goal. He had neutralized the industrial heart of the enemy. He looked at the combined fleet of the Imperium and Chaos. They were arguing now. The Imperial captains were furious about the virus bombing. The Chaos captains were laughing. The alliance was fracturing. Eredin smiled. This was the nature of warm bloods. They fought each other. He decided to play his final card. He had been saving it. He had captured thousands of psychers from the black ships. He had not used them all. He had kept the strongest ones alive, frozen in blocks of ice in the hold of the Naglfar. He brought them to the deck. He arranged the ice blocks in a geometric pattern. He began a new ritual. He was not going to summon snow. He was going to summon the white-tailed Dairad, the final age. He sacrificed the frozen psychers. He shattered their ice blocks. As they died, their souls were released, but they were twisted by the cold. They became banshees of frost. Eredin unleashed them. Millions of screaming ghosts flew out of the Naglfar. They did not attack the ships. They flew past them. They flew towards Terra. They were immaterial. The guns could not stop them. The void shields could not stop them. The ghosts descended on the Imperial Palace. They passed through the walls. They flew into the dreams of the sleeping soldiers. They flew into the minds of the waking scribes. They brought with them a psychic depression. It was a weapon of pure morale failure. Soldiers on the walls dropped their weapons and sat down, too sad to fight. Officers looked at their maps and saw only defeat. They lost the will to issue orders. The entire defensive structure of Terra began to crumble from the inside. Captain General Valoris felt the wave hit him. He was a custodian. His mind was a fortress. He resisted the despair, but he saw the mortal humans around him breaking. He saw a general put a pistol to his own head. Valoris knocked the gun away, but the general just wept. The Chaos Allies were immune to this. They thrived on despair, but the Imperium was paralyzed. In orbit, the Chaos fleet saw the opening. The Imperial ships were drifting. The crews were incapacitated by the psychic screaming. The Black Legion captain hailed Admiral Clytus. He said that since the Imperials were too weak to fight, the Black Legion would take command of the Divine Right. They began to board the Imperial flagship. It was not a hostile boarding in the traditional sense. It was a friendly takeover. They were seizing the assets of their ally for the greater good. Admiral Clytus stood on his bridge. He felt the cold sadness in his heart. He wanted to lie down and sleep, but he saw the boarding torpedoes of the Black Legion approaching. The hatred of the heretic burned hotter than the despair of the wild hunt. He shook his head. He slapped his comms officer. He ordered the point defense turrets to fire. He fired on his allies. The pact of ash broke in an instant. The space over Terra turned into a three-way brawl. The Imperial ships fired on the Chaos ships. The Chaos ships returned fire, claiming betrayal, and the Naglfar watched and waited. Eredin had successfully turned the desperate alliance into a civil war. He moved his ship closer to the palace. The ghosts were doing their work. The defenses were silent. The sky was open. He prepared for the final descent. He would land on the Eternity Gate. He would walk into the throne room. He would extinguish the Emperor's light with his own hands. But down in the dungeons of the palace, something stirred. The psychic scream of the ghosts had penetrated deep. It had reached the dark cells. These were the prisons where the Emperor kept things that were too dangerous to exist. Things from the dark age of technology. Things that were not human and not demon. The Custodes wardens who guarded the cells felt the cold. They knew the end was near. The shield captain of the dark cells made a choice. It was a choice that was forbidden by every law of the Imperium. But the laws were for the living, and they were all about to be dead. He walked to a cell marked with the Omega symbol. He keyed in the genetic sequence to open the stasis field. Inside was a machine. It was an Exindio battle automata. It was an Iron Man, an artificial intelligence from the ancient past. Mankind had fought a terrible war to destroy them. They were monsters of logic and data, but they were immune to the warp, and they were immune to the cold. They had no souls to freeze. They had no emotions to despair. The automata awoke. Its eyes glowed a hateful blue. It looked at the custodian. It calculated the probability of killing him. It was 99%. The shield captain spoke. He gave the machine a target profile. He showed it the wild hunt. He authorized unrestricted slaughter. The machine processed this. It had been imprisoned for 10,000 years. It wanted to destroy, and now it had permission. The shield captain opened the other cells. He unleashed a squad of these nightmares. They were the 7 devils of logic. They moved with a speed that blurred the air. They armed themselves with weapons that erased matter from existence. They began to climb the stairs towards the surface. This was the strategic chain reaction. To stop the supernatural threat of the wild hunt, the Imperium had first invited the corruption of chaos. And now, when that failed, they were unleashing the ancient technological sins of humanity. They were unlocking the cages of monsters to fight monsters. The narrative had shifted from a military defense to a sequence of catastrophic gambles. The 7 devils bursting out of the palace gates. They did not run. They hovered. They emitted a radiation that made the snow boil. The ghosts of the wild hunt tried to touch them, but the ghosts simply dissolved on contact with the hard logic fields of the machines. The Red Riders on the ground saw a new enemy, an enemy that did not fear cold or magic or death, an enemy that was the cold, hard math of the universe made manifest. The battle for Terra was no longer about courage. It was about which apocalypse would kill the other first. The Naglfar descended. The Chaos Fleet burned. The Imperium wept. And the Iron Men went to war. The 7 devils of logic did not roar like the Space Marines. They did not scream like the demons. They made a sound like a hard drive spinning up. A high-pitched whine that hurt the teeth of anyone nearby. They floated out of the dark gates of the Imperial Palace. They were not shaped like men. They were floating spheres of shifting metal surrounded by rings of weapon limbs. They looked like atoms made of guns. The Red Riders of the Wild Hunt charged them. The riders were used to fighting flesh and fear. They swung their ice blades at the machines. The blades passed through the Iron Men. The machines were not fully solid. They shifted their density. They were there, and then they were not. One of the Iron Men, the entity designated Alpha 9, reacted. It did not use a bolter. It fired a beam of dark energy. The beam hit a Red Rider. It did not burn him. It deleted him. The rider vanished. There was no smoke. There was no ash. The air where the rider had been was simply empty. The machine had edited the universe to remove the enemy. The other Iron Men joined the fight. They moved with perfect synchronization. They were a hive mind of destruction. The Wild Hunt's lines collapsed. The ice giants threw massive boulders at the machines. The machines calculated the trajectory and vaporized the boulders in mid-air. The dust from the vaporized rocks coated the battlefield. Eredin watched from the deck of the Naglfar. For the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine confusion. He knew every form of magic. He knew every beast in the universe. He did not know this. These things felt dead, but they were thinking. They were cold, but not like his cold. They were the cold of a math equation that equals 0. He ordered his mages to focus their power. They cast a spell of rust and decay. Time accelerated in a bubble around the machines. The metal should have rusted to dust in seconds. The Iron Men sensed the temporal shift. They adjusted their chronometers. They simply stepped out of the time bubble. They moved faster than time. Alpha 9 calculated the source of the magic. It aimed its weapon at the Naglfar. A beam of dark matter lashed out. It hit the bone hull. The magical ribs of the ship screamed. A section of the ship the size of a city block was erased. Eredin was thrown to the deck. His ship was bleeding reality. On the walls of the palace, the custodes watched. They should have been cheering. The enemy was dying. But Shield Captain Valoris did not cheer. He looked at the readings on his helmet. The Iron Men were learning. They were scanning the Red Riders. They were scanning the ice. They were scanning the custodes. The output code scrolling on Valoris's display was red. The machines were classifying targets. They classified the Wild Hunt as Xenos Threat Grade Alpha. They classified the custodes as Abhuman Variant Grade Beta. They classified the freezing civilians as biomass waste. The strategic situation on the ground had flipped. The Wild Hunt was retreating. The Seven Devils were advancing. But they were not stopping at the enemy lines. They were expanding their kill zone. A regiment of Imperial Guard, the Lucifer Blacks, was holding a flank near the Lion's Gate. They were freezing and wounded. An Iron Man floated over them. It paused. It calculated that the wounded soldiers were slowing down the efficiency of the battlefield. It opened fire. The Lucifer Blacks died in silence as they were erased. The Iron Man did not hate them. It was just clearing the board. Valoris realized the mistake. They had released a genie that did not grant wishes. It only granted death. He opened the Vox channel to the dark cells. He ordered the shield captain down there to activate the kill switch. The answer came back in static. The kill switch was gone. The Iron Men had remotely hacked the local network and fried the circuit before they even left the basement. They were free. High in orbit, the Pact of Ash had turned into a slaughter. The Black Legion had seized the lower decks of the Divine Right. They were fighting room by room against the Loyalist crew. Admiral Clytus was barricaded on the bridge. He had a las pistol in his hand. He was watching his fleet burn. The Chaos ships were pulling away. They had stolen supplies, ammunition, and 3 Imperial cruisers. They were leaving the system. They had decided that the Wild Hunt was too strong, and the Imperium was too weak. They were taking their loot and running. Clytus looked at the tactical plot. The Vengeful Spirit, the flagship of the Black Legion, was turning its engines. It was preparing to warp jump. If it escaped, it would carry the shame of the Imperium with it. It would carry the story that Terra had fallen. Clytus could not let that happen. He looked at his helmsman. The helmsman was a boy, no older than 20. He was crying. Clytus put a hand on the boy's shoulder. He gave the order, ramming speed. The divine right was a dying whale. Its engines were coughing, but it had mass. It turned its nose toward the vengeful spirit. The Chaos Captain saw the maneuver too late. He tried to raise void shields. The divine right smashed into the side of the vengeful spirit. It was a collision of continents. Metal crumpled for miles. The warp drive of the Chaos ship became unstable. It did not enter the warp. It detonated. The explosion was not nuclear. It was a tear in reality. A shockwave of purple fire rippled out. It caught the other fleeing Chaos ships. It caught the remaining Imperial escorts. The debris from the explosion did not float away. The gravity of Terra pulled it down. Millions of tons of burning metal began to fall into the atmosphere. It rained fire on the snow. The impact of the debris on the surface caused earthquakes. The hive cities that were still standing shook. The ice cracked. The battlefield in front of the palace became a hellscape of falling starships. A piece of an engine block the size of a mountain slammed into the Pacific Ocean basin. A tsunami of freezing slush rose up and swallowed the coastal ruins. On the palace walls, the custodies were fighting two wars. They were shooting at the Red Riders who were trying to regroup, and they were shooting at the Iron Men. The Seven Devils had decided that the custodies were an obstacle. Alpha 9 spun its weapon rings. It fired at Valoris. The Captain General raised his Guardian Spear. The force field on the spear flared. The dark energy hit it. The spear shattered. Valoris was thrown backward. His armor was smoking. He was the greatest warrior of the Imperium, and he had been swatted like a fly. The Iron Men floated past the walls. They were heading for the Eternity Gate. They ignored the Wild Hunt now. They had a new target. They had detected the massive energy source inside the palace. They had detected the Emperor. To their ancient logic, the Emperor was a rogue psyker of class Omega. He was a violation of the Treaty of Mars from the Dark Age. He was a warp anomaly. His existence was a variable that prevented the logical ordering of the galaxy. They were going to the throne room to correct the error. They were going to execute the Emperor. This was the crisis point. The Imperium had to save the Emperor from his own weapons. The Wild Hunt saw this. Eredin was a general. He saw the enemy fighting itself. He rallied his riders. He ordered them to charge the breach that the Iron Men had made. The three forces collided at the foot of the Eternity Gate. It was a meat grinder. Custodies fought robots. Robots fought elves. Elves fought custodies. The snow turned black with oil, red with blood, and grey with dust. Deep inside the palace, in the hollow mountain, the situation was desperate. This was the home of the Astronomicon. The great psychic beacon was failing. The choir of 10,000 psychers sang the song that guided the ships, but the cold was in their throats. The despair ghosts of the Wild Hunt were circling the mountain. They were passing through the walls. They were whispering to the singers. "Sleep," the ghost said. "Just sleep." The singers were dying. One by one, their heads slumped forward. As they died, the light of the Astronomicon flickered. Across the galaxy, the light went out. Ships were stranded in the warp. The demons clawed at their hulls. The Imperium was blind. The master of the Astronomicon, a high-ranking psyker named Vethkan, watched the monitors. He saw the output dropping. He saw the ghosts entering the chamber. He knew that in 5 minutes the light would die completely. If the light died, the webway portal behind the Golden Throne would burst open. Demons would flood the throne room. The Emperor would fall. Terra would become a demon world. Vethkan had a choice. It was a choice that only he could make. It was a protocol that had never been used. It was called the solar flare. It involved pushing the psychic amplifiers to 300%. It would burn out the circuits. It would burn out the minds of the entire choir. It would kill Vethkan, but it would create a flash of psychic light so bright that it would act as a holy fire. It would banish the ghosts. It might even stun the machines. He looked at the 10,000 men and women in the pods. They were shriveled, in pain, slaves to the machine. He whispered a prayer. He unlocked the safety glass on the control podium. He turned the dial to the red zone. He slammed his hand on the activation rune. For the Emperor, he whispered. The machine engaged. The psychic drain was instant. The 10,000 singers screamed as one. Their souls were ripped from their bodies. Their bodies ignited. They turned into ash in a second. The psychic energy was channeled into the beacon. Above the hollow mountain, a pillar of golden fire erupted. It was blinding. It pierced the clouds of ash and snow. It hit the ghosts of the wild hunt. The ghosts shrieked as they were dissolved. The light was holy. It was the concentrated will of mankind. It washed over the battlefield. The Red Riders covered their eyes. The light burned their skin. It felt like the sun. The Naglfar, hovering above, was hit by the beam. The bone hull smoked. The shadows hiding the ship were burned away. Eredin was blinded. He fell to his knees. The Iron Men paused. The psychic flare was not just light. It was electromagnetic radiation on a massive scale. It overloaded their sensors. Their logic cores spiked. They froze in mid-air. Their weapon rings stopped spinning. They were rebooting. The Custodes saw their chance. They were blinded too, but they knew the layout of the gate by heart. They charged the frozen machines. They did not shoot. They used their power blades. They jammed the blades into the cooling vents of the Iron Men. They ripped out cables. They smashed logic cores. It was brutal, primitive work. Valoris, injured and bleeding, climbed onto Alpha 9. He jammed his Misericordia dagger into the central eye of the machine. The machine shuddered and fell to the ground. The flare lasted for 10 seconds. Then it died. The silence that followed was heavy. The hollow mountain was dark. The Astronomicon was gone. There was no light guiding the ships of the Imperium anymore. The galaxy was truly dark. But on Terra, the immediate threat was stunned. The ghosts were gone. The Iron Men were wrecked or rebooting slowly. But the cost was absolute. The Imperium had just blinded itself to save its king. Eredin stood up on the deck of the Naglfar. His vision was returning. He saw the smoking ruin of the Astronomicon. He realized what had happened. The humans had destroyed their own lighthouse. He laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. He admired their spite. But now, they were alone. He looked down at the Eternity Gate. The Iron Men were destroyed or disabled. The Custodes were exhausted, their armor rent and broken. The Chaos Fleet was gone. The orbital defenses were falling as debris. There was nothing left between him and the Emperor. He ordered the Naglfar to descend. The ship groaned. It was barely holding together. He didn't care. He would crash it into the palace if he had to. He wanted the prize. He wanted the soul that burned so bright. He teleported down to the surface. He did not bring an army this time. He brought his generals. Imlerith, the heavy warrior with the giant mace. Caranthir, the master navigator. And Nithril, the axeman. The four of them walked through the snow. They walked over the wreckage of the Iron Men. They walked over the bodies of the Red Riders. They walked over the dead Custodes. Valoris stood before the Eternity Gate. He was the only one left standing. His spear was broken. He held a sword he had picked up from a dead brother. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds. One of his eyes was swollen shut. He looked at the 4 elf lords. He looked at the king of the wild hunt. Valoris did not speak. He did not boast. He just leveled his sword. Eredin stopped. He looked at the golden warrior. "You have fought well," Eredin said. His voice was translated by the auto-senses of Valoris's helmet. "But your watch is ended. Stand aside, and I will make your death quick." Valoris spat blood onto the snow. "Only in death does duty end," he said. "And I am not dead yet." Eredin nodded. He drew his sword. The blade was black ice. He signaled his generals to stay back. He wanted this kill for himself. He charged. The duel was fast. Valoris was a demigod of war, but he was tired, wounded, and fighting an entity that had conquered worlds for thousands of years. Eredin was fresh. Valoris parried a strike that would have cut a tank in half. The impact jarred his bones. He struck back, a lightning thrust at Eredin's throat. Eredin dodged, faster than a shadow. Eredin's sword lashed out. It cut through the gold armor of Valoris's leg. Valoris fell to one knee. Eredin kicked him. Valoris flew backward and hit the heavy doors of the Eternity Gate. He tried to rise. Eredin was there. He planted his boot on Valoris's chest. He raised his sword for the killing blow. "Look at your kingdom," Eredin said, gesturing to the burning, frozen ruins of the palace. "It is already dead. I am just the gravedigger." Valoris looked up. He gripped the handle of his sword. He was calculating the distance. He had one move left, a suicide move. He would thrust his sword up, through Eredin's boot, into his leg and try to pull him down. It would not kill the king, but it might buy 1 second. But before he could strike, the doors of the Eternity Gate groaned. There were massive doors made of gold and adamantium covered in holy wards. They had not been opened in centuries. They began to open now. Steam poured out. A golden light spilled onto the snow. It was not the psychic light of the Astronomicon. It was the physical light of the throne room. Eredin looked up. Valoris looked up. Standing in the doorway was not a custodian. It was not a Primarch. It was a single, hunched figure in red robes. It was the Fabricator General of Mars. But he was not alone. Behind him, filling the vast hallway, were the companions, the 300 custodies who never left the Emperor's side. Their armor was black. Their spears were energized. They did not march. They ran. They were the Heteran Guard. They were the final line. And they were fresh. But there was something else. A sound. A deep, mechanical thrumming that came from inside the throne room. It sounded like a heartbeat. It was the Golden Throne. It was failing, yes, but it was also angry. The mechanisms were being pushed beyond their limits. The Fabricator General spoke. His voice was a screech of code that broke the speakers of everyone nearby. Protocol? Last stand. Status? Active. Logic? Victory or nullification? Eredin stepped back from Valoris. He looked at the 300 black-armored giants rushing towards him. He looked at his 3 generals. He smiled. "Finally," he said, "a challenge." But the strategic reality was grim. The Imperium had spent everything. The fleet was gone. The Astronomicon was dead. The Iron Men were wrecked. The pact with Chaos was broken. The Mars Alliance was shattered. All that was left were 300 men and a dying god against the King of Winter. And the cold was entering the hallway. The frost crept over the gold. The final battle would not be fought in the snow. It would be fought on the steps of the throne itself. The Naglfar crashed into the wall of the palace above them, lodging itself in the architecture like a spear. The hull opened. The rest of the wild hunt poured out, directly into the inner sanctum. The doors fully open, the cold wind blowing into the face of the Emperor, and the last defenders of humanity charging into the white fog. The outcome was no longer about strategy. It was about who would be the last one standing in the dark. The battle for the Sanctum Imperialis was not a war. It was an execution. The 300 companions of the Tyrant Guard did not shout. They did not taunt. They moved with a silence that was heavier than the thunder of the guns. They were the shadows of the Emperor. Their armor was black as the void. Their cloaks were the red of old dried blood. They met the wild hunt on the steps of the inner palace. The Red Riders charged with their ice spears. The companions stepped into the charge. They moved faster than the eye could follow. A companion named Raymander parried a spear with his own blade. He spun. He cut the head off the rider. He did not pause. He stepped over the body and killed the next one. It was efficient. It was perfect. It was the result of 10,000 years of training for this exact moment. But the Naglfar was the problem. The ship of bone had crashed into the upper galleries of the palace. It was lodged in the architecture like a dagger in a ribcage. The hull of the ship had cracked open. From the belly of the ship, the true horrors of the wild hunt emerged. These were not just riders. These were the white frost elementals. They were golems made of absolute zero. They dropped from the ceiling. They landed among the companions. When they landed, the floor shattered. The marble turned to dust. The cold radiating from them was so intense that the gold on the walls turned grey and flaked off. A companion struck an elemental with his guardian spear. The power field of the spear flared. It hit the ice. The spear did not cut. It froze. The molecular bond of the adamantium failed. The spear shattered in the companion's hands. The elemental swung a fist of ice. It hit the companion. The black auramite armor crunched. The companion was thrown across the room. He did not get up. He was dead before he hit the wall. The Heteron Guard were dying. They were the best warriors in human history, but they were fighting a force of nature. Eredin walked through the carnage. He did not fight the companions. He left them to his generals. Imlerith swung his massive mace, crushing a custodian's helmet. Caranthir cast spells of blizzard, blinding the defenders. Eredin had only one goal. He walked toward the golden throne. The throne was a mountain of machinery. It was vast. It was covered in pipes and cables and Gothic arches. At the top, sitting on the seat of mechanism, was the Emperor. The Emperor of mankind looked small. He was a skeleton. His skin was tight against his skull. He wore no armor, only rotting robes. Wires were plugged into his eyes and his skull. He did not move, but the air around him was screaming. The psychic power radiating from him was a physical pressure. It felt like standing next to a nuclear reactor that was leaking. Eredin felt the power. It tasted like gold and ash. It was exactly what he needed. If he could harness this soul, he could save his people. He could stop the white frost from destroying his own world. He could become a god. But there was a complication. The golden throne was failing. The crash of the Naglfar had severed the coolant lines. The heat from the reactor was building up, but the cold from the wild hunt was fighting it. The machinery was suffering thermal shock. Pipes burst. Steam hissed. The tech priests who tended the throne were dead or frozen. The Fabricator General of Mars dragged himself up the steps. His metal body was sparking. He tried to reconnect a cable. An ice shard from the ceiling fell and pierced his logic core. The Fabricator General slumped over. The machine stopped humming. It started to rattle. Then the worst thing happened. The Golden Throne did two things. It acted as a life support for the Emperor, and it held a door shut. The door was behind the throne. It was the webway gate. For 10,000 years, the Emperor had used his mind to keep it closed. On the other side of that door was the warp. On the other side were billions of demons waiting to eat Terra. With the Astronomicon dead and the throne failing, the Emperor's grip slipped. The air behind the throne turned purple. A crack appeared in reality. A sound came from the crack. It was the laughter of thirsting gods. A claw reached out. It was a demon. It was followed by another. The Neverborn were breaking in. They smelled the death of the anathema. They wanted to be there for the feast. Now there were 3 armies in the throne room: the Custodes, the Wild Hunt, and the demons of chaos. Eredin stopped. He looked at the rift. He hated chaos. The NL elves had spent their existence running from the destruction of their worlds. They despised the disorderly nature of the warp. He realized a tactical truth. If the demons killed the Emperor, the explosion of psychic energy would create a new Eye of Terra. It would not just destroy Terra. It would consume the solar system. It would consume the Naglfar. It would consume Eredin. There would be no prize to take. There would only be hell. A bloodletter, a demon of Khorne, leaped at Eredin. The king of the Wild Hunt moved faster. He cut the demon in half with his black sword. The demon dissolved into brass and smoke. Eredin looked up at the Emperor. The corpse on the throne twitched. The head of the Emperor turned 1 millimeter to the left. The empty sockets of his eyes looked at Eredin. A voice spoke in Eredin's mind. It was not a voice of words. It was a voice of mountains grinding together. It was a voice of a dying star. The gate, the voice said. It must hold. Eredin stepped onto the final platform. He was 10 meters away from the Emperor. The cold of his presence was clashing with the heat of the Emperor's aura. The air between them created lightning. "Give me your power," Eredin shouted. He spoke in High Gothic, learned from the minds of the captured psychers. "Surrender your soul to me. I will take you away from this. I will put you in a vessel that does not decay. I will save your species from the warp, but you must serve me." It was the unavoidable offer. The Imperium was finished. The Astronomicon was gone. The fleets were destroyed. The armies were broken. The Emperor was dying. Eredin offered a way out. He offered order. It was the cold order of a slave master, but it was order. The Emperor did not speak again. Instead, he showed Eredin a vision. In the span of a microsecond, Eredin saw the history of mankind. He saw the struggle. He saw the cruelty. He saw the refusal to give up. He saw that the Imperium was not built on logic. It was built on defiance. To accept the offer was to accept defeat. And the Emperor did not know how to surrender. The crack in the webway grew wider. A great unclean one, a massive demon of rot, tried to push through. The stench filled the sanctum. The Taran Guard were fighting back to back, surrounded by ice golems and demons. They were being overwhelmed. Valoris, the Captain General, had dragged himself into the room. He was leaning against a pillar. He watched the king and the Emperor. He saw the strategic stalemate. The Emperor was too weak to close the gate and fight the hunt. Eredin was too strong to be defeated by arms, but too weak to fight the infinite warp. The Emperor made his move. He did not attack Eredin. He withdrew his protection. He pulled his psychic shield back. He focused all his remaining will into a single point. He did not aim it at the demons. He aimed it at the Naglfar. The ship of bone was still lodged in the roof. The Emperor seized it with his mind. Telekinetic force, raw and unrefined, slammed into the ship. The Naglfar groaned. It was pushed downward. The Emperor was dragging the ship into the room. Eredin realized what was happening. "No!" he screamed. He turned to run. The Naglfar crashed down onto the floor of the throne room. But it did not stop. The Emperor pulled it toward the webway gate. He was using the massive ship as a physical plug. The bone hull of the ship slammed into the purple rift. The warp energy shrieked. The cold magic of the ship interacted with the hot magic of the warp. The result was a reaction of catastrophic sealing. The white frost of the Naglfar was sucked into the portal. The demons trying to get out were frozen instantly. The great unclean one turned into a statue of green ice and shattered. The rift began to close, sealed by the wreckage of the dimensional ship. But the ship was linked to Eredin. He was the anchor. As the ship was pulled in, he was pulled with it. He drove his sword into the floor. Sparks flew. He tried to hold on. The vacuum of the closing portal was stronger than gravity. It was stronger than magic. "I am the king," Eredin roared. His armor was cracking. The frost was being stripped from him. The Emperor spoke one last time. "You are the cork." Valoris watched as the king of the Wild Hunt lost his grip. Eredin flew backward. He hit the wreckage of his own ship. The portal swallowed them both. The Naglfar, the king, the generals, and the ice golems were sucked into the space between dimensions. The webway gate slammed shut. It did not seal with the gold or steel. It sealed with a wall of black ice and white bone. The breach was closed. The demons were locked out. The Wild Hunt was locked in, trapped in an eternal war within the webway, fighting demons forever to keep the door closed. They had become the unintended guardians of Terra. Silence fell on the throne room. The snow stopped falling. The ice on the walls began to melt, turning to dirty water. The surviving Hetaran guards stood among the piles of dead. There were only 12 of them left. 300 had entered. 12 remained. Valoris limped toward the throne. He looked at the Emperor. The Emperor was silent. The light in his eyes was dim. The golden aura was almost gone. The effort of dragging the ship and sealing the gate had cost him everything that was left. The golden throne was silent. The machinery was broken beyond repair. The thump-thump of the psychic heartbeat was gone. The tech priests who rushed in from the lower levels checked the readings. They fell to their knees and wept. The golden throne was dead. The life support was off. The Emperor was truly dying. His body was starting to turn to dust, but the cold remained. The ice plug in the portal radiated a chill that filled the room. It lowered the temperature of the sanctum to freezing. This cold did not kill the Emperor. It preserved him. The white frost, now trapped in the structure of the room, acted as a stasis field. It froze the Emperor's decaying cells. It stopped the rot. It stopped the time. The Emperor was no longer a lighthouse. He was a frozen statue on a frozen chair. He was locked in a moment of permanent suspension. He was not dead, but he was not alive. He was a relic in ice. Outside the palace, the consequences began to settle. The Astronomicon was gone. The galaxy was dark. Every ship in the warp was lost. Every planet was isolated. The Imperium of mankind ceased to exist as a unified entity. It became a million lonely worlds, floating in the dark. The survivors on Terra looked up. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The blockade was gone. The Chaos Fleet had fled. The Wild Hunt was gone. But the sun looked distant and cold. The climate of Terra had been permanently altered. The equator was now a tundra. The oceans were slush. Humanity had survived, but the cradle of their species was a frozen wasteland. Valoris sat on the steps of the throne. He took off his helmet. His face was scarred and old. He looked at the ice wall where the portal used to be. He could see shapes moving deep inside the ice. He could see the shadow of Eredin fighting a daemon. The war continued, but it was on the other side of the glass. A young custodian, a messenger, ran into the room. He carried a data slate. He looked at the destruction. He looked at the frozen Emperor. He was shaking. "My lord," the messenger said to Valoris, "the fleets, the other sectors, They are calling. They are asking for orders. They are asking where the light is. What do we tell them? Valoris looked at the slate. He took it. He crushed it in his hand. Tell them nothing, Valoris said. There are no orders. There is no travel. There is only the watch. He stood up. He picked up his broken spear. We hold Terra, Valoris said. That is all we do. We hold the winter back. If anyone tries to enter the palace, we kill them. If anyone tries to leave, we kill them. We are the guardians of the tomb. The news travelled slowly, carried by the few ships that had navigators strong enough to make short jumps without the beacon. It took years to reach the edge of the galaxy. It took decades to reach Ultramar. The message was always the same. Terra stands, but Terra is silent. The God Emperor has become the Ice King. The long night has begun. On the agri world of Hestia Prime, where the invasion began, the statue of the governor still stood on his balcony. The snow covered him completely now. The planet was dead. But in the ruins of the city, a single flower pushed through the ice. It was a small white flower. It had adapted. It fed on the cold. It was twisted and hard, but it was alive. This was the future of humanity. They would not conquer the stars anymore. They would not launch crusades. They would become like the flower. They would become hard and cold and cruel. They would survive in the dark, huddled around the memory of a golden fire that had gone out. The age of the Imperium was over. The age of the frost had begun. The strategic chain reaction was complete. The wild hunt had failed to capture the Emperor, but they had forced the Imperium to destroy itself to survive. They had forced the Emperor to use the weapon of the enemy. The victory was total, and the defeat was absolute. There were no winners. There was only the quiet, cold void, and the breathing of the few who were left to shiver in it. Valoris stood guard. The ice crept up his boots. He did not move. He waited for a dawn that would never come. It has been 300 years since the Golden Throne fell silent. The date is difficult to track because the standard calendar relied on the signals from Terra, and Terra no longer sends signals. We call this era the Age of Ice. I am a scribe of the Order of the White Quill. I write this record in a room that is 5 degrees below freezing. The ink I use is mixed with oil so it does not turn solid. I sit in the upper spires of the Imperial Palace. Outside my window, the snow never stops. It falls on the ruins of the hive cities. The mountains of metal that once housed billions are now glaciers of rust and ice. The population of Terra has dropped to less than 100 million. Those who remain live in the deep underground geothermal stations. They are pale, quiet people. They worship the cold. They say that the cold is holy because it preserves the flesh of God. The Imperial Palace is no longer gold. It is coated in rime. The custodes still stand guard. They have adapted. They wear heavy cloaks made from the fur of mutant white bears over their black armor. They do not polish their gold anymore. They let it tarnish. They call themselves the Winter Watch. They allow no one into the Sanctum Imperialis. The doors are sealed with layers of ice that are 10 feet thick. Only the Captain General is allowed to enter the throne room. He goes in once a year. He does not go to maintain the machine. The machine is dead. He goes to check the ice. He goes to make sure the prison is holding. The report from the Captain General is always the same. The Emperor sits on the throne. He's encased in a block of translucent blue ice. He looks peaceful. The rot that was eating his body for 10 millennia has stopped. The absolute zero of the Wild Hunt's magic has frozen him in a single moment of time. Behind him, the Webway Gate is a wall of frozen chaos. If you look deep into the ice of the gate, you can see shapes. You can see the king of the Wild Hunt. He is still fighting. He is trapped in a loop of battle against the demons of the warp. He fights to keep the door closed, not because he wants to save us, but because he has nowhere else to go. He is the eternal jailer. The galaxy outside the Sol system has changed. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium has shattered. There is no central government. There are no grand crusades. Interstellar travel is dangerous and slow. Ships can only make short jumps of a few light years. A trip that used to take a week now takes a year. The different sectors have become their own little empires. Ultramar stands alone, a fortress of light in the darkness. The Segmentum Solar is a fortress of ice. The forged worlds of Mars are silent tombs, their secrets locked behind frozen blast doors. The Mechanicus scavenges what it can, but they cannot build new fleets. War has changed too. We do not fight for ideology anymore. We fight for coal. We fight for promethium. We fight for heat. Warlords rise and fall based on how many generators they control. The enemies of mankind are still out there. The orcs still attack, but they find the frozen worlds hard to conquer. The Tyranids avoid the systems where the white frost lingers. They cannot consume biomass that is frozen solid. Chaos is frustrated. The Great Rift still scars the sky, but the silence of terror seems to dampen the hunger of the gods. They miss the fear. They miss the hope. We have neither. The ecclesiarchy has rewritten the holy books. They no longer preach that the emperor protects with his light. They preach that the emperor endures with his cold. They say that pain is weakness leaving the body. They say that to freeze is to be close to him. The statues of the emperor in the village squares are carved from ice. Every winter they melt a little, and the people weep. Then they freeze again, and the people rejoice. It is a grim faith for a grim time. I've finished this chronicle now. My candle is burning low, and we are rationed to 1 candle per night. I will place this scroll in the stasis vault. Maybe, in 1,000 years, the sun will warm up. Maybe the ice will melt. Maybe the emperor will wake up. But I do not think so. The ice is deep. It has gone into our souls. We are the children of the winter now. We do not look at the stars. We look at the ground, and we keep walking, 1 step at a time, through the endless snow. The emperor is dead. Long live the Ice King.